Mr. Chairman, friends, not too long ago, we were a nation full of self-pity, self-flagellation, and a sense of doom and deprivation. In about 12 years' time, I think significant changes are evident today. Earlier we've been talking about them, but now we are seeing some of them. I remember some 20 years ago when I was Special Officer of India's largest public sector undertaking at the time, about 8,000 crores investment, Visakhapatnam Steel Project. Until that time, I was a great socialist, like many of my generation were. Many of you would laugh at us to think that there actually could be some socialist thinkers and believers some 20, 25 years ago. But that stint cured me of many of those illusions, because I had then discovered that public sector was nothing but the private sector of those in public office. But that knowledge dawned on the people of this country at large and the governance system almost a decade later. We were very slow. But mercifully, it happened, even if it's out of compulsion, though not out of conviction. And things started changing, and that's the reason why we're now discussing what we're discussing. If Sanjay Bauru talks about how to take on the world on equal terms without a sense of fear or trepidation, and also with a sense of ease, giving and taking, fulfilling our obligations, accepting the challenges, and becoming a major power. Or if Dr. Khanna is talking about India's potential and promise and changing nature and our perception, not only self-perception, but the global perception of India, from a caged tiger, the famous Economist issue of 4th of May 1991. Some of you might have read it. For many of us, of the slightly elder generation, that was one of the most defining pieces of journalism, one of the most spectacular pieces of journalism, talking about our promise and potential and our problems. 2, being a majestic elephant, hopefully. But where are we now? In terms of geopolitical terms, I thought that Sanjay would take up some of these, so maybe I would go into some of the specifics. He gave you a broader picture of India, its future, its potential, its promise, and its challenges. 3 days ago, I was talking to a very perceptive American about India's role within our own neighborhood. He said, if India starts negotiating with Bhutan, India will end up becoming Bhutan. That started a chain of thought in my mind. Somehow, we still have not come to believe that we matter bigger than Bhutan or Nepal or Bangladesh or Pakistan. Somehow, when we deal with Bangladesh, for instance, we all the time look at Farakka barrage. We somehow try and browbeat, not realizing that there are actually gains to be made for both of us, and we need to be generous, not merely out of charity, but out of enlightened self-interest. Look at the Asian Highway. It's one of the most promising things for this country. For the first time, we are looking east. We are now thinking of linking up with Southeast Asia in a substantial measure. Look at our own states of UP and Bihar, some of the most backward in the world, some of the most populous, some of the most densely populated in the world. And I do not see any significant political solutions in the next few years. They're possible, but they're not practical given Indian constitutional and political constraints. One way to really reshape the future of something like 280 million people in those 2 states alone, and maybe if you include Bengal, Northeast, and Orissa, you're looking at something like 400 million people. And that's a large number. To reshape their future is linking up with Southeast Asia, and the road link is a critical one. And we still could not make Bangladesh understand that it's critical for their future as well as important for our own future. We still have to go through Siliguri to a very tortuous route and we still cannot link up the way we ought to. Take the case of Nepal. I am an agnostic, I don't care a damn for religion. But there is a natural link between Nepal and India, and yet you go to Nepal and there is a perception that somehow India is a bit of a nuisance. Nepal is a very reluctant ally. Many Nepalese think that Indians are big brothers. And yet from a purely economic standpoint of view, Nepal has excellent terms of trade in terms of textiles, garments. If Indians know how to invest in Nepal, have a good relationship with Nepal, have a good feeling for them, look at their future, then Indians could take great advantage of those terms and then give benefits to Nepalese people and Indian capital, and maybe even Indian workers, because there are no real barriers between Nepal and India. Or take the problems of internal security within the country. Naxalites in Andhra Pradesh, People's War Group, to the whole belt spreading up to Nepal, the Maoists. There are links. If we trust them, if they trust us, not merely fear us, maybe together we could confront the challenge effectively. The point I'm making is, if we want to make a significant geopolitical contribution and play our rightful role, first we must look at our neighbors. If only because we are infinitely bigger, with a far greater civilizational sense, with much greater level of confidence, we can afford to do that on terms which are not necessarily in the short term equal. It need not be. Eventually, we will all gain, because India cannot prosper if South Asia does not. Let's look a little towards the West. Pakistan, of course, the problems are well known. But go back a century or more. In those days, I do not know how many of you are aware, much of the global politics was centered around the warm water port, the requirements of warm water port for Russia, the Tsarist expansion of Russia, and the occupation of Central Asia, and somehow getting a corridor to the Arabian Sea via Afghanistan. And that's why the then British Indian government fought 3 Afghan wars in order to conquer and control Afghanistan. Of course, they were all doomed to failure ultimately. But the issue is, even today, how do we somehow establish a linkage with Central Asia, which is no longer a part of the Soviet Union? How do we make an impact? That means we have to deal with Islam, we have to deal with terrorism, we have to deal with a host of other factors, because oil, natural gas, and many other things that are of strategic importance in the next 25 to 30 or 50 years, they're all going to be dependent on what we do on the West for this country. There's much to be done. There's a lot that we have to understand. I don't know how many of you even can name the 5 Central Asian republics, which were once part of the Soviet Union. I don't know if many of the Indian people and businesses actually are going there and trading with them, interacting with them, understanding them, and trying to shape their countries and shape our own relationship with those countries, and therefore our own future. And of course, China. Sanjay made significant points, but let me make one point which is optimistic. Despite all the unfavorable comparisons, one good thing that's happening is our own sense of a long-term vision. 20, 30, 40 years ago, we all used to say, whatever be the failings of China, that's a country with a long-term national vision. They look at themselves and look at the world in terms of 50 years, 100 years. They have a truly long-term national vision, whereas we always look for tomorrow, day after, somehow manage, survive. But I think happily we must give it to our political system across the spectrum. It's not this party or that. We now are looking a little towards the long term. For instance, the National Highways Project, the Sagarmala, the Asian Highway that I talked about, and the significant diplomatic initiatives of Look East policy, as well as looking towards Central Asia and the West Asia, and even our relationship with China and the rest of the world. All these are now shaped by a sense of long-term vision, and I think many people, Sanjay included, have played a significant role in changing this perception of ourselves and our future. The real issue is not abroad. I'm sure the Swamiji must have told you in the first session in this Vedanta lecture that ultimately we must look inward. If you want to conquer the world, you must first set your house in order. What is our unique selling proposition? What is the single biggest factor that changed the perceptions and reshaped India's image in the eyes of the rest of the world? That is the educated manpower, people like Professor Khanna. They went and conquered. They proved to the world that they are in no way secondary to anybody in the world. In fact, we claim that we have the world's second or third largest technical manpower pool. But let's be truthful and realistic. We have the potential to have the world's second or third largest technical manpower pool. In reality, we are grossly underperforming. Our higher education is in a mess, let alone literacy that Amartya Sen talked about. Professor Khanna mentioned that. But our higher education is in a state of collapse. A few world-class management institutions and IITs do not constitute a world-class infrastructure for the country and its future, if you want to really play a global role. Sanjay told me that tomorrow his article is going to appear in the Financial Express, seeking the sack of Professor, I don't know if he's a true professor or not, Professor Joshi, Murali Manohar Joshi, the Minister of Education. There is no conception of education. I'm not even bothered about trivia of the IIM fee and things like that. I'm looking at the university system. It's a disgrace. We take some of the brightest youngsters and convert them into monkeys in a few years' time. And there are a few non-monetary inputs. You don't have to think of high-tech rocket science, simple non-monetary inputs. As I understand, no Harvard scholar can go back to Harvard and be a teacher immediately after his master's or his doctorate. MIT or Stanford or anybody else, they don't allow this kind of incestuous academic activity. They want cross-fertilization of ideas. Now, to simply adopt this practice does not require money. It doesn't require genius. It requires common sense. I remember seeing a New Zealand university advertising for its president globally. A small, tiny country of 3 million people asking for a university president from across the world. I remember a professor in biological sciences telling me some time back from one of the Indian universities that he was in a small little country called Eritrea. Many of you might not even remember where that wretched place is. I said, how was it there? He said, there's no comparison. I said, was it that bad? He said, no, it's so wonderful compared to Indian universities. Eritrea, damn it. A second example of educational excellence, for instance. The system of electives was started in Harvard some 130 years ago by Charles Eliot. Even today, when you go to undergraduate, postgraduate schools in this country, and you all have gone to this country, I'm sure, in some of these schools, you have this prefabricated set of academic curricula. At CBZ, by PC, and some other nonsensical combination, without a perception of anything that matters, without adding value, without making you decision makers, without making you wealth creators in the true sense of the term. Or take the examinations. All that matters is ignore last year's question papers, mug up the 3 preceding year's question papers and their answers, and you're sure to get a 75% grade, and you call yourselves a masters, and so on, so subject. We have to significantly alter the nature of education because that is our unique selling proposition, and the future is going to be shaped by education. And of course, healthcare. Regional inequality. Take the state of Bihar. Its per capita income already is under 1/4 of India's richest state among major states, and that is Maharashtra. And this ratio is going to be 10-to-1 in the next 8 to 9 years at the current rate. We cannot afford that. Population. Happily, some states are showing the way through a few strategic initiatives, notably Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in recent times, but through different routes. We can do it, but we have to do it across the country. But finally, Mr. Chairman, let me conclude. Can a modern economy coexist with medieval polity? Some 25 years ago, Daedalus, an American journal, was talking about American medicine, and they came out with a wonderful expression. They said, doing better and feeling worse, is this an apt description of American medicine? Well, that may or may not be, but that, I think, is an apt description of what India is today. We certainly are doing better, but we're also feeling worse in many respects, and we don't deserve to. We don't need to. We can make a difference only if there is a significant political reform, because economic reform absolutely necessary but not sufficient. Corruption has come down in some areas like telecommunications, railways, and many other sectors. The range of goods is expanded, the choices are greater, the prices are stable. We are happy. But corruption has shifted to more dangerous areas. Take the Telegi stamp scam. Take Sachin Dube's murder in Gaya. Take the leak of question papers by Sanjeev Kumar. I don't know if you read it in newspapers. That fellow's annual income was 100 crore rupees from examination leaks alone. And his dream was to be the next MP and would have surely been the next minister. Why only an MP? And of course, take the case of the arrest warrants issued against the President of India and the Chief Justice of India for 40,000 rupees. The issue is not about corruption. The issue is about shifting corruption from the economic areas of decision-making to the sovereign spheres of decision-making, from where the state cannot be rolled back. That can and must be addressed, but only through significant political and governance reform. If we really care for economic growth, if we want to be global champions, if we want to be among the 6 global powers that Kissinger predicted, then we have to set our house in order. And one of the most important ingredients is going to be the way our polity is shaped. We must make sure that integrity and survival in public office are compatible. Some 15 years ago, in the then Soviet Union, similar conditions prevailed. There was a very popular story in those days, I believe in a Moscow Russian shop. In front of a Russian shop, some 200 people queued up to get a few crumbs of bread. They waited and waited and waited for hours. A superpower, no bread. One young man lost his temper, and ultimately he walked out, stormed out in protest, and said, "I'll go and kill the General Secretary in Kremlin." The others waited. Still there was no bread in sight. He came back after 3 hours. They all gathered on him and asked him, "What happened?" He said, "Have you killed the General Secretary?" He said, "I went there to kill the General Secretary, but there was a much longer queue waiting there." They simply waited. They did not do what was necessary in time. They hoped that somebody, somewhere, would take care of the problems. The day of reckoning came in 1991. The nation, you know what happened, became 15 fragments. Soviet Union is a pale imitation of its past. Russia is now floundering. It will come back, surely, but there's a lot of needless suffering. We will make a substantial impact on the world in the next 50 years. This century could yet be India's along with China's, but only if we now act decisively with clarity and conviction, not by daydreaming. Thank you.